Before anything changes in a person's life, there is a truth that must be faced with seriousness. Because many people know that prayer matters, yet very few truly understand what prayer is capable of doing when it is engaged with force, faith, and spiritual intelligence. As revealed in prayer is not presented as a soft religious routine, but as a force that can shift stories, recover what was lost in earlier seasons, confront hostile powers in the heavenlies, and reverse what was programmed against destiny. And this matters because many people are not suffering merely because life is difficult. They are suffering because invisible decisions have been taken against them, because patterns have been arranged above them, around them, and sometimes even before them. And if those patterns are not challenged, they continue as if they have the right to remain. What if the reason many lives do not move forward is not the absence of effort, but the presence of hidden resistance? What if what is delaying progress is not visible on the surface, but operating in unseen places? What if some people are fighting earthly symptoms while ignoring heavenly programming that keeps reproducing the same limitation? Because once something is programmed into the heavenlies against a person's destiny, it does not always show itself immediately as disaster. Sometimes it appears first as stagnation, as delay, as repeated disappointment, as helpers that never arrive on time, as stories that refuse to change even though effort is present. And over time, this creates weariness because the person senses that life should be different but cannot explain why movement remains so slow. This is why the cry for change becomes necessary, not as emotional noise, but as spiritual insistence. Because there are moments when a story must no longer be tolerated in its present form. A person reaches a point where they can no longer accept repetition, no longer accept the same disappointment, no longer accept the same blockage, no longer accept the same reduction. And that is where prayer begins to rise, not just as desire, but as demand before God for reversal. And once that shift happens, prayer becomes more than words. It becomes contention. It becomes pressure in the spirit. It becomes a point where the person refuses to let the old pattern continue unchallenged. This is why the language of "let my story change" is not simple at all, because it is a confrontation with continuity. It is a refusal to let the current condition define the future. It is a declaration that what has been repeated must now be interrupted by divine intervention. Many people think change comes only by time, but there are changes that time alone will never produce. There are things that must be broken, things that must be scattered, things that must lose their hold before the future can open the way it should. And this is why serious prayer is not passive, because passive prayer may express pain, but it does not always enforce reversal. The kind of prayer being pointed to here is prayer that targets the unseen, prayer that challenges what was programmed, prayer that calls for acceleration, remembrance, movement, and a complete change of story. And when this kind of prayer rises from the heart, something begins to happen, not only around the person, but within them. Because they stop living as though their current condition is final, they stop assuming that delay is permanent, they stop treating the present arrangement as if it cannot be overturned. And that inner shift is powerful, because once a person no longer agrees with what has been holding them back, they begin to pray differently, believe differently, and position themselves for interruption from heaven. This is where the battle begins to turn, because what was once tolerated is now resisted. What was once endured is now challenged, and what was once accepted as normal is now exposed as something that must not remain. And when that happens, a person is no longer just asking for help, they are engaging heaven for a complete rewriting of their story. Once a person begins to understand that stories can change through prayer, the next thing that must be understood is why certain stories remain unchanged for so long. Because many people are not just dealing with delay, they are dealing with forces assigned to preserve delay. Powers arranged to keep progress from becoming visible, and systems in the unseen that attempt to make an old condition look permanent. As shown in, there are powers programmed into the heavenlies, stagnating powers closing the book of remembrance, powers assigned against a person's times and seasons. And this means the battle is not always against what is happening now, but against what has already been arranged to prevent what should happen next. What if the issue in many lives is not only that blessings are delayed, but that the very memory of those blessings has been contended with? What if some people are not simply forgotten by men, but resisted by powers that fight remembrance? What if the reason help is late is because something is contending with the timing of its release? Because when a person's book of remembrance is symbolically closed, they can work hard and still remain overlooked. They can qualify and still remain bypassed. They can be present and still not be considered. And over time, this creates frustration because the life contains value, but the value is not being acknowledged where it matters. This is why serious prayer becomes necessary, because there are battles that no networking can solve, no explanation can untie, and no human effort can fully reverse until something changes in the unseen order behind the visible outcome. There are also powers that target times and seasons. And this is serious because if a person's timing is attacked, even good opportunities can arrive in distorted form. Help can come too late. Movement can happen after damage. And what should have been celebrated can become a story of almost. And this is why the language of my times are in your hand carries such force, because it is not merely a comforting statement. It is a declaration of ownership, alignment, and refusal to let hostile powers govern what belongs in God's hands. Many people are not destroyed by lack of destiny. They are weakened by timing battles, by delays that keep them from stepping into what was meant to happen in its proper season. And once timing is distorted, discouragement begins to grow. Then there are powers that enforce stagnation, not by removing all movement, but by producing movement without advancement, activity without increase, effort without arrival. And this is dangerous because it keeps a person busy while progress remains blocked. A person can look occupied, committed, and even hopeful, yet inwardly know that something is not shifting the way it should. And over time, this kind of stagnation becomes exhausting because it steals not only opportunities, but confidence. This is why the prayers here are not ordinary prayers, because each one is directed at a different layer of resistance. Each one carries an agenda. Each one attacks a distinct pattern. And this teaches something important. Serious prayer is not vague. It is precise. You do not only pray for general blessing, you confront the powers that block remembrance. You confront the powers that manipulate times. You confront the powers that enforce stagnation, because once these hidden structures are left untouched, they continue reproducing the same disappointments. And when a person begins to see this clearly, they stop treating repeated outcomes as accidents. They begin to recognize hostile design behind certain patterns, and this recognition sharpens how they pray. No longer just, Lord, help me somehow, but Lord, arise against what is arranging my delay, against what is closing my remembrance, against what is resisting my times and seasons. And that change in prayer matters because it marks the transition from emotional frustration to spiritual precision. And once precision enters prayer, the battle is no longer random, it becomes targeted. And targeted prayer is how hidden resistance begins to lose its hold. Once these hidden structures are recognized, another truth must be faced with even greater seriousness, because the battle is not only against delay itself, but against the emotional and spiritual consequences delay tries to produce inside a person. As reflected in the prayers, do not only target powers in the heavenlies, they also press towards story change, remembrance, acceleration, and the release of long-awaited help. And this shows that heaven is not only interested in stopping resistance, but in preventing the damage that resistance tries to plant within the soul. What if the deepest harm of prolonged delay is not the missed opportunity alone, but the slow corrosion of hope? What if the real danger is not only the blocked door, but the inner agreement that begins to form when blocked doors repeat too often? What if some people are carrying not just postponed testimonies, but wounded expectation? Because when a person waits too long under repeated contradiction, something subtle begins to happen. They start to lower what they expect. They begin to assume that maybe this is how life will remain. They stop asking boldly. They stop planning confidently. They stop preparing with joy. And over time, the outer stagnation begins to reproduce itself inwardly as passivity, dullness, and quiet surrender. This is why serious prayer must strike both dimensions at once. It must confront what is fighting the future, and it must also break what that fight is producing inside the person. There are powers that do not only delay manifestation, they try to train the person into resignation. They want the heart to become tired, the voice to become weak, the expectation to become small, and the imagination of possibility to shrink until the person no longer believes strongly enough to contend. This is why the cry for story change is so important. Because a story is not only what has happened, it is the direction a person begins to expect, the pattern they begin to live under, the version of life they slowly accept. And if that story is not interrupted, a person can begin to live beneath divine intention while still calling themselves hopeful. But prayer at this level refuses that quiet surrender. It says there must be a change, not only around me but within me, not only in circumstances but in atmosphere, not only in opportunities but in expectation. This is where the believer must begin to understand that every repeated disappointment is trying to write a false narrative over the life. And unless that narrative is confronted, it begins to define how the person sees themselves, how they see God's timing, and how they interpret every future opportunity. What if the enemy does not only want to delay your blessing, but also wants to educate your emotions into unbelief? What if the goal is not only to block progress, but to make you stop preparing for it? What if the battle is not only over events, but over vision? Because once the inner vision dims, even open doors may be mishandled, even divine help may be overlooked, and even answered prayers may arrive to a person no longer inwardly ready to receive them. This is why the prayers here carry urgency, because they are not merely about movement in the unseen, they are also about rescuing the person from the psychological and spiritual damage prolonged delay tries to inflict. And when heaven begins to answer that cry, something changes, not only because hostile structures begin to scatter, but because the person begins to recover expectation, boldness, and the capacity to believe again without apology. This is the moment where prayer stops being only a cry for relief and becomes a recovery of inner strength. Because once the heart is no longer bowed down by repeated postponement, the person begins to stand differently, ask differently, and move differently. And that matters because a changed story must first become believable within the person before it becomes visible around them. Once the inner damage of delay begins to heal, the next reality that must be understood is that change expectation alone is still not enough unless it is matched by spiritual confrontation, because hope without engagement can still leave hostile structures in place. And many people feel encouraged for a moment yet return to the same cycle because what was opposing them was never directly challenged. As seen in the prayers move with unusual force against powers in the heavenlies, stagnating powers, unseen assignments, bitter waters, wicked weapons, and demoting influences. And this reveals something vital. Some battles do not dissolve through inspiration. They must be broken through direct spiritual resistance. What if part of the reason many lives remain under repeated pressure is not because heaven is unwilling to intervene, but because the person has not yet become serious enough to contend? What if the issue is not absence of prayer, but absence of violent precision in prayer? What if certain structures remain because they have only been mentioned before God but never truly confronted? Because there are forces that specialize in maintaining atmosphere. They do not only attack once, they shape conditions. They preserve heaviness, they reinforce disappointment, they keep the person circling around the same emotional, financial, relational, or vocational frustration until the struggle begins to feel normal. This is why the cry against stagnating powers programmed into the heavenlies matters so much. Because stagnation is not always laziness and delay is not always passivity. Sometimes what looks like inactivity is actually obstruction. And unless obstruction is named and resisted, the person may continue blaming themselves for what is in fact being enforced from outside their visible effort. There are also powers that close remembrance, meaning they interfere not only with progress but with recognition. They affect visibility, timing, connection, and the mysterious moments when a person should suddenly come to mind before the right helper, the right system, the right door, the right moment of favor. When remembrance is resisted, a person may be qualified and still overlooked, gifted and still bypassed, available and still forgotten, and this can slowly train the mind toward discouragement. But direct prayer breaks agreement with that pattern. It says, "No longer will my life be hidden under strange powers. No longer will my season be delayed by hostile programming. No longer will what belongs to me in time and manifestation remain locked away." This is where prayer becomes less sentimental and more judicial. Less about expressing frustration and more about issuing spiritual refusal. And that shift matters because hostile structures often remain where they are merely observed, but begin to lose stability where they are consistently opposed. What if some delays are sustained because they have not yet met a praying person who refuses to be quiet? What if some repeated disappointments remain because they have not yet met sustained contradiction from heaven-backed prayer? What if some stories are waiting for the day someone becomes spiritually tired of the old narrative and begins to forcefully call for reversal? Because there are moments when prayer must become confrontation against the script itself, against the version of life that has been repeating, against the demotion, the commonizing, the reduction, the quiet dismantling of promise. And when that level of prayer rises, something begins to shift. Not always first in visible signs, but in the architecture of resistance itself, because what was coordinated begins to lose order. What was scheduled begins to lose timing, and what was assigned begins to lose peace. This is how pressure in the spirit works. It unsettles what was previously settled against you. And once hostile order begins to break, manifestation begins to have room. So now the believer must understand that hope must be armed, expectation must be enforced, and story change must be prayed through with enough seriousness that the unseen powers resisting it begin to scatter under the pressure of divine confrontation. Once hostile structures begin to lose order under serious prayer, the next thing that must happen is recovery, because it is not enough that resistance weakens if what was delayed, buried, diverted, or held back is not intentionally called forth again. As reflected in the movement of these prayers is not only against opposition but toward restoration, toward remembrance, toward story change, toward the return of what should have manifested long before now. And this reveals something crucial. Spiritual warfare is incomplete if it only stops the enemy but does not recover what the enemy interfered with. What if some people have already experienced partial victory but are still living below their proper level because what was stolen in time was never pursued back? What if the real issue is no longer only that powers are resisting them, but that years, opportunities, favor, visibility, and breakthroughs lost under those powers have not yet been summoned back into order? What if freedom from attack is only the beginning and not the completion of the matter? Because when delays persist over years, they do more than postpone events, they alter momentum, they displace opportunities, they interrupt connections, they create emotional fatigue, and they leave gaps in the story that must now be deliberately addressed. This is why the cry for story change is so powerful, because it is not merely asking for a better feeling, it is demanding a different outcome, a different narrative, a different sequence, a different testimony from the one that hostile powers had been enforcing. And story change requires more than relief, it requires restoration, acceleration, and divine intervention at the level of timing itself. Many people do not realize that some prayers are not just prayers of resistance, they are prayers of recovery, prayers that pull back what should not have been lost, prayers that call remembrance back into operation, prayers that reopen books closed by invisible hands, prayers that shift a person from almost to arrival, from promise to manifestation, from repeated waiting to visible movement. What if the breakthrough you seek is not entirely new, but partly the release of what had already been yours, but was held under string delay? What if the answer is not only ahead of you, but also behind you, in the sense that certain things must be brought back from where they were interrupted? What if heaven is not only preparing new doors, but also restoring delayed outcomes? Because when God changes a story, it does not merely add a pleasant moment to an unchanged pattern. He interrupts the old script entirely. He overturns sequences. He rearranges outcomes. He accelerates what looked buried, and he causes what seemed forgotten to become undeniable. This is why prayer at this stage becomes specific and expectant. No longer only Lord fight for me, but also Lord return what was delayed. Lord reopen what was closed. Lord, cause the people assigned to my help to remember me. Lord, restore the movement that was interrupted. Lord, let my story no longer read the same way. And once this kind of prayer rises seriously, something begins to move not only in the atmosphere of resistance, but in the direction of testimony, because the same heaven that can scatter an enemy can also gather a lost season. The same God who can stop a hostile agenda can also fast forward a delayed promise. This is where faith must become very active, because recovery often begins before evidence appears. And the believer must learn to contend not only against what was wrong, but for what must now be made right. And that shift matters. Because once a person starts praying for restoration with the same seriousness they once used against oppression, their life begins to move from survival into reconstruction, from mere relief into recompense, from being defended to being remembered, restored, and repositioned. Once recovery begins to move from prayer into expectation, another truth must be embraced. Because restoration that is not received with spiritual readiness can still be delayed at the point of manifestation. And this is where many people unknowingly struggle, not because heaven has refused them, but because their inner life has not yet adjusted to what their prayers are demanding. As revealed in the language of these prayers, it's not only about change in circumstance, but about manifestation, about God doing something so visible that the world itself must acknowledge His hand. And this means the matter has now moved beyond hidden relief into public evidence. What if the next level of your story is not simply that pain reduces, but that power becomes visible? What if God is not only ending an old season, but bringing you into a form of manifestation that will contradict what people thought about you? What if the real victory is not merely private comfort, but undeniable proof that heaven has stepped into your case? Because there comes a point in a person's life where it is no longer enough for things to be slightly better. There must be a visible rewriting, a divine interruption so strong that the old interpretation of the life can no longer stand. This is why the prayer for manifestation carries such weight, because manifestation is what happens when invisible dealings begin to produce public evidence. When what God has been doing in hidden places begins to appear in ways that silence mockery, reverse shame, and create astonishment. Many people have lived too long under reduction, demotion, and quiet resistance. And because of that, they have unknowingly adjusted themselves to a smaller version of life. They have learned how to endure being overlooked, how to live under delay, how to survive beneath their level. And unless that inner reduction is broken, they may still shrink back even when manifestation begins to knock at the door. What if part of the reason some people do not fully step into their next season is that they are more familiar with pressure than with elevation, more familiar with explanation than with evidence, more familiar with prayer against attacks than with expectation for public turnaround? Because manifestation requires readiness not only spiritually but inwardly. The readiness to be seen, to be lifted, to be accelerated, to be placed where favor can no longer be hidden. This is why the prayers here move toward divine elevation, divine manifestation, and the breaking of whatever cries against rising. Because there are forces that may not stop your existence, but are determined to stop your appearance, to keep your star buried, your name hidden, your progress delayed, your story unchanged. And once that becomes clear, the believer must begin to pray, not only to survive but to emerge, not only to be defended but to be displayed by God's hand, not in pride but in proof. This is where faith must grow stronger than memory, because past disappointment often trains the mind to fear visible hope. But manifestation demands that the person begin to believe again for what is large, undeniable, and public. It says that the same life once mocked can become the life honored. The same story once pitied can become the story discussed with amazement. The same person once delayed can be suddenly elevated in a way that makes it impossible to give the credit to human effort alone. And when this kind of prayer rises, something powerful happens within. The person stops preparing only for survival and starts preparing for appearance, for favor, for movement, for the kind of change that alters how others relate to them. This is why manifestation is a serious matter, because it is not merely personal satisfaction. It is the point where God contradicts a hostile narrative with visible evidence. And once a person begins to pray from that understanding, they are no longer asking only for hidden help. They are calling for a season where heaven's answer can no longer be concealed. Once a person begins to understand manifestation as visible proof of divine intervention, the next truth that must be established is that manifestation does not occur in a vacuum. It must confront whatever is still contesting it at the root. And this is why the battle often becomes more precise just before public change begins to appear. As reflected in, the prayers move into deeper territory, into evil harvest by parents, destructive promises made for a person's sake, the blood of Jesus delivering the roots, and hidden spiritual transactions that were designed to bind a life before it could rise. And this reveals something very serious. Some battles are not only about present resistance, they are about inherited arrangements, old agreements, and deep-rooted claims that continue to speak against elevation until they are directly silenced. What if the reason some lives keep struggling at the edge of manifestation is not because the future is closed, but because the roots are still under argument? What if the surface has changed, but the foundation is still being contested? What if the delay is no longer in the visible world, but in the unresolved spiritual history behind the life? Because there are things that do not merely attack progress from outside. They speak from underneath, from roots, from covenants, from destructive words, from unholy promises, from family altars of agreement that were never consciously chosen by the person, but still attempt to enforce consequence. This is why prayer at this stage becomes deeper and more surgical. No longer only, Lord, change my story, but Lord, deliver my root. Lord, cancel what was spoken for my sake. Lord, break what was promised against my future. Lord, silence what is still arguing against my manifestation. Many people do not realize that you can fight present battles and still leave ancient claims untouched. You can pray for open doors while old voices are still challenging your right to enter. You can ask for favor while deep-rooted accusations continue to demand delay. And this is why the blood of Jesus becomes central here. Because there are battles that cannot be won by emotion, by repetition, or by human intensity alone. They require a higher claim, a deeper cleansing, a stronger legal answer than the one the enemy is presenting. What if some struggles continue because the person has addressed the branch but not the root? What if the visible pressure keeps returning because the invisible claim has not yet been cut off? What if manifestation is waiting for the roots to be set free? Because once roots are delivered, something profound begins to happen. Cycles lose their depth, repeated patterns lose their source, destructive promises lose their force, and what once felt strangely inevitable begins to break apart. This is also the stage where many people experience unexpected shifts, because when deep spiritual contentions begin to collapse, changes can become sudden, dramatic, and undeniable, and this is why the prayers in this season cannot be casual. You are not merely asking for improvement, you are calling for foundational liberation, for the cancellation of deep agreements, for the dismantling of every hidden arrangement that was designed to produce a future beneath God's intention. And once this happens, the person is no longer only being defended from attack, they are being released from mystery, released from inherited resistance, released from deep structures that once determined what could or could not happen in their lives. This is where manifestation begins to move with unusual force, because the battle is no longer only being fought at the level of events, it is being settled at the level of roots. And once the roots are cleansed, healed, and delivered, what begins to rise is no longer fragile, it is supported by a foundation that is finally being brought into freedom. And now everything comes to its final point. Because once the hidden resistance has been confronted, once the story has been challenged, once the powers in the heavenlies have been addressed, once remembrance has been reopened, once delay has been resisted, once manifestation has been prayed into visibility, and once the roots themselves have been delivered, there remains one final reality that must settle in the heart of the believer. All of this is meant to bring you into a life that no longer bends under the old pattern, but rises under a new order of divine intervention and visible proof. As reflected in the movement of these prayers, is not toward temporary relief, but toward divine manifestation, elevation, story change, and the public evidence that this is the finger of God, and that matters. Because many people have lived too long under hidden warfare without visible vindication. What if the final stage is not simply that your enemies are weakened, but that your life becomes the answer to their mockery? What if the real end of the matter is not merely that evil plans fail, but that your story is rewritten so clearly that even those who doubted must admit that God has intervened? What if the purpose of all this warfare is not only to stop destruction, but to establish undeniable testimony? Because there comes a point where heaven does more than defend, heaven begins to display. And when God enters that stage, what was once delayed begins to move with force. What was once hidden begins to appear openly. What was once mocked begins to be honored. And what was once written off begins to manifest in a way that cannot be explained by human timing alone. This is why the prayer for manifestation is so serious. Because manifestation is not merely personal satisfaction, it is divine contradiction against an old narrative. It is God saying that the story people accepted about your life is no longer the story that will stand. It is the end of silent reduction, the end of hidden demotion, the end of repeated smallness, and the beginning of visible evidence that your times are truly in God's hands. Many people want relief, but heaven wants more than relief. Heaven wants revelation through your life, proof through your story, testimony through your turning point, because when divine manifestation takes root, it does not only change your private emotions, it alters your visible reality, your position, your timing, your opportunities, your honor, your speed, your sense of direction, and even the way people must now respond to you. This is why the final prayers are so weighty, because they are not merely asking for another small improvement. They are pressing for a season to change, for time to shift, for God the changer of seasons and times to arise, and manifest His power in a way that no old arrangement can withstand. And once that happens, the life is no longer living beneath a hostile pattern. It begins to move under divine order, under visible favor, under unusual intervention, under the kind of manifestation that makes people stop and say, this is not ordinary. This is where the believer must now settle their heart. Because if God has brought you to the point of manifestation, then you must no longer prepare for the old story. No longer speak as though nothing can change. No longer agree with delay. No longer live under the shadow of what was broken. You must begin to stand as one whose roots have been delivered, whose timing has been reclaimed, whose remembrance has been reopened, whose manifestation has been called forth, and whose story is now under active rewriting by the hand of God. And that is where the matter closes. Not with fear, not with exhaustion, not with endless postponement, but with praise. Because once the believer has fought through prayer, once the roots have been cleansed, once the hidden powers have been addressed, the proper end is thanksgiving. The confidence that God is able, that He heals the brokenhearted, that He sets the captives free, that He carries His people through, and that what began as warfare now turns into testimony. So the final truth is clear. This is not the end of your struggle only. It is the beginning of your visible proof. Not the end of attack only, but the beginning of manifestation. Not merely the breaking of a hostile pattern, but the establishment of a new season where your life no longer reflects what fought you, but reflects the hand of the God who changed your story.